This is Butler on Business, your home for economics from a free market perspective.
All right, Jason, it's time to go over the Federal Reserve. Everybody's heard the term central bank. We described a central bank. You know what a fiat currency is. It's paper money backed by nothing. We've given you the history of the dollar. Now we're going to get to the root of the problem. Once you understand what the Federal Reserve really is, and we've alluded to it, but once you understand what the Federal Reserve really is and how it came about, you will begin to understand some of the madness that's going on. Jason, tell them about the creature from Jekyll Island.
Sure. Henry Ford once said, Alan, that it's well enough the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning. The Federal Reserve System does not need to be audited, as a lot of people say. That's not going to tell us anything we don't already know. It needs to be abolished. We already know it is one of the greatest scams in the history of the world, forget the United States. And we know exactly what it's doing. Economics, basic economics, tells us it is incapable of accomplishing any of its stated objectives.
Stated objectives.
It is a private banking cartel operating against the public interest. Folks, they are stealing your money. Now, I wanted to talk today about the creation of the Federal Reserve, how it came into existence, and I think that this story is very telling. How it came to be gives us a good picture about what it's doing today. Now, in 1910, the Federal Reserve was conceived during a highly secretive 9-day meeting on Jekyll Island, and I need to remind everybody, this is not a conspiracy theory. Everybody involved in this meeting, they were quiet for a few years until the system got set up, but after that, they came out in magazines, newspapers, they published books. It all became public knowledge what they did down on Jekyll Island. It was down on Jekyll Island here in Georgia, even in the private club where they met. Now, if you go down there, and I've never been, Alan, but there's a plaque on the wall that says, in this room, the Federal Reserve System was created. Now, like I said, this meeting was publicized now, but for a long time, it was a secret. Well, how did it come to be? The story really starts with Senator Nelson Aldrich, Republican senator. He instructed 6 other well-known men to join him on a private train car in New Jersey, and they were going to go for a trip down to Jekyll Island. They were instructed to come separately. They were told to act like they did not know one another, to avoid all reporters. One man, he even carried a shotgun and planned to use the excuse that he was going on a duck hunting trip if he was questioned. It later came out in his biography that he had never fired a gun in his entire life. So these men, once again, were told that once on board the train to only use their first names because they didn't want to arouse any suspicion from the servants or wait staff. 2 men even adopted code names. And once on Jekyll Island, these men met for 9 days to hammer out the details of the Federal Reserve System.
I'd like to jump in for a second, Jason, and point out the need for this secrecy is there were 2 politicians, and the rest of these guys were competitors. So what you had was a group of northeastern New York-based bankers. There was a couple Europe representatives from Europe as well. Were meeting in violation of our laws to hammer out the creation of our Federal Reserve. These guys were competitors that came together in secret and had this meeting. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, let's dig into that, Alan. Who was at this meeting? Who were the men there that devised the system that is now our Federal Reserve System, now our monetary system? Well, we had, of course, like we said, Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was the majority whip for the Republican parties and chairman of the National Money Commission. He was a business associate of J.P. Morgan. He was the father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller Jr. and was the grandfather of Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, who served as vice president under President Ford. We also had Abraham Andrew, who was the assistant secretary of the Treasury. He was at the meeting. And now we get into the big bankers who were at the meeting. Alan, as you mentioned, these were all competitors of one another. We had Frank Vanderlip, who was president of the National City Bank of New York, which at the time was the largest bank in the country. He represented the financial assets of people like John D. Rockefeller. We had Henry Davidson, who was the senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. Charles Norton was the president of the First National Bank in New York, also a very large bank at the time. Benjamin Strong, this guy was known as the lieutenant of J.P. Morgan. He was head of the J.P. Morgan Banker Trust Company and incidentally became the first head of the Federal Reserve. That's convenient. And we had Paul Warburg, who was one of the wealthiest men in the world. He was a recent immigrant from Germany, and he was a partner at the Kuhn-Loeb Company. that represented the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France. So he had extensive knowledge about how the central banking system worked in Europe.
And so to put this collection of people in your mind, it would be as if the head of ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, all the oil companies got together in a secret meeting using first names only, coming in under the cover of darkness, and having a meeting. And tell them what was going on at this meeting.
So they were having a meeting about how to regulate the oil industry in your example. Well, together these men represented about a quarter of the wealth in the entire world at the time. And these were the men that were going to create the system to control how our banking system would operate. So Senator Aldrich, he came back to Washington after they had the plan and tried to pass this bill that his banker buddies had written. However, since he was a Republican with ties to the big banks, the bill was shot down. So they didn't give up. They got two Democrat senators, Glass and Owen, to sponsor a bill, and they added a few provisions, like one that said that the Fed just couldn't print all the money it wanted willy-nilly. But when they did this, ironically, Aldrich and Vanderlip and some of the other big bankers, once they had convinced the Democratic senators to sponsor a new bill, they publicly spoke out against the Democrat bill. They said that this bill would ruin big banks. So, of course, to the average person on the street, when they hear these big bankers going around saying that this was bad for banking, they supported it. They thought, well, if it's bad for banking, it's probably going to be good for us. But at the same time, these guys were privately funding the passage of the bill through other propaganda measures. So at the same time, people were publicly condemning the bill, and they were privately financing the support of it. This bill passed in December of 1913, and Woodrow Wilson signed it into law the very next day. So this was an instance similar to what happened with Obamacare, that they ran it through Congress
during a recess,
right before Christmas, signed it into law immediately, and
while all of the opposition had already left Washington to start their holiday. They brought in enough supporters of the legislation while everybody else was out of town to pass the legislation.
And the big key, Alan, and they made this very clear, it's come out years after it was intact, but they didn't care if there were some unfavorable provisions in the initial bill, because they knew that once the system was set up, they would be able to amend it and change the legislation to get the system how they wanted it. And that's exactly what's happened now. The bill, or the law, I should say now, that created the Federal Reserve has now been amended nearly 200 times since it was initially set up. And that is to get this banking system exactly how the bankers wanted it. Now, as we consistently mention, the Federal Reserve Act formed a private banking cartel. This cartel is in partnership with the government, but, Alan, I like your analogy. This banking cartel is no more federal than Federal Express. It's just in the name only. It's not a part of the U.S. government.
Yes, if you go to look up the Federal Reserve, it's not in those blue pages next to the Federal Aviation Administration. It's in the white pages by Federal Express. It is a privately owned, for-profit banking cartel. Just picture a party of the nation's greatest bankers stealing out of New York under the cover of darkness, traveling hundreds of miles down to the coast of Georgia. When they're there, under the cover of darkness, they get on small launches and head over to Jekyll Island. And then they meet for more than a week in total secrecy. They had all of the regular servants there leave the island, and they brought in people who would not know who these guys were, and that was the setup for this meeting. Now, the structure that these gentlemen came up with was a pure cartel. The composition of this group on Jekyll Island was a classic example of a cartel structure. In a cartel, a group of independent businesses joined together to coordinate the production, pricing, and the marketing of their members. The purpose of a cartel is to reduce competition and thereby increase their profitability. This is accomplished through a shared monopoly over the industry in which they are in. If the OPEC members meet, they determine who's going to produce what, how much they're going to charge for oil. That is a classic cartel structure. So is our Federal Reserve System. And to understand what prompted these guys to meet like this and to set up this cartel, this banking cartel we now call the Federal Reserve, you have to understand what was happening in the country at the time. As the country was growing, the number of banks that were springing up outside of the New York area was growing in large numbers. And this was a threat to the New York bankers. It was competition that they did not want to have to deal with. So New York was losing their concentration of power over the banking system. It's no coincidence that Wall Street is up there and that all these guys are right around that Wall Street area. That's what the creation of the Federal Reserve was designed to protect, was to keep that money interest up there in New York, controlled by the large New York banks. But that was the first thing. It was the growing competition from all of these banks that were springing up primarily in the South and the West. Jason, you look like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to, if you're done with talking about the cartelization of the banks to concentrate power of New York, one of their other objectives of the meeting was to reverse the trend of private capital formation. At this time, people and corporations were starting to use their own savings instead of going to banks for loans. So the banks wanted a way to encourage people to come back to them for loans. Well, how did they do that? They wanted a way to artificially suppress interest rates below the market levels so that people would be able to come to them for loans. So how do they do this? They needed a flexible currency. In other words, one that they could inflate. And this is how they would do it, was having a private banking cartel and a monopolization of the money supply.
Well, we had a caller yesterday wondering why the interest rates were so low on her savings. Pure classic cartel structure. The Federal Reserve basically creates money out of thin air and then lends it to the banksters, the members of the Federal Reserve System. Zero money. I mean, the money cost them nothing. Why should that lady's bank pay her anything in interest when they're getting money created by the Federal Reserve lent to them at 0% interest? There's no incentive. But back prior to the creation of the creature, the interest rates were set by the market. The banks that paid the most interest attracted the largest amount of capital. There was a free market system on interest rates. You know how periodically when the FOM meet and everybody's hanging by the thread wondering what the Federal Reserve is going to do with interest rates, whether they're going to go up or go down or remain the same? That's a classic cartel. It's the same thing that OPEC is doing. When OPEC meets and decides they're going to cut production to raise the price of oil or they're going to increase production to lower it, that's the same thing that the Fed governors are doing, but their monopoly is not oil. Their monopoly is our money. So it is a classic banking cartel. They wanted to be able to have a monopoly over the creation of money. They wanted to be able to create the money, and they wanted to have a lever where they could control interest rates. They were behaving like a cartel. They are a cartel. This meeting was illegal, and that's why they met in secrecy. What they put together down there was a criminal act, and our Congress, under Woodrow Wilson, made legal a crime in the country.
Alan, you know, one of the other goals of these private banksters was to create a system, a banking system, where they could pass their losses off to the taxpayer without them knowing it. Now, they were talking about bailouts long before this current round of bailouts, and in fact, there have been many, many bailouts performed by our central bank, by the Federal Reserve, before the ones that have gotten a lot of publicity over the last couple of years.
We had a guest on yesterday from the University of Georgia, Dr. Selgin, and he pointed out what the Federal Reserve should have done during the financial crisis was not bail out the guys, the bad guys, the guys who crashed the system, the guys who bet on those mortgage-backed securities and lost. They should have been allowed to fail. In a free enterprise system that does not have a banking cartel running our currency, those banksters would have failed, and they should have failed. But the Federal Reserve, since it is a privately owned corporation, could not allow their banking cartel members to fail. So what they did is they did what this meeting set out to do. They passed the losses of the banksters off onto all of us. We picked up the tab for their reckless behavior. Now, Paulson and Bernanke got up there, and they tell you all these dire warnings. If we don't get this money, it's almost like the Y2K phobia that was going on. The ATM machines weren't going to work. The lions and tigers were going to be set loose from the zoos. That's the same crap that those two guys peddled that day. They had to have that money. Otherwise, we were all going to suffer. So they weren't really doing it for them. They were doing it for us. We, the people. Don't believe that crap. This rapidly declining dollar, that was their plan. They passed those losses, their losses, off onto us, and we are now suffering the consequences. And Republicans and Democrats alike voted to pass the TARP. Anybody, any politician that voted to pass the TARP made a conscious decision to stick you with the bill when they blew up the mortgage-backed securities, Jason.
Yeah, I wanted to send a message out to the Republicans, the fiscal conservatives out there. If you are truly for fiscal conservatism, if you're for small government, you need to be against the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is the central engine that allows government spending to grow to the size it has today. If you are a liberal, if you are a Democrat, if you are for eliminating or at least reducing the exploitation of the little guy.
The poverty,
exactly. If you are for standing up for the little guy against big corporations and the banksters or whatever your cause may be, you have to go after the Federal Reserve. It's a two-way system right now. The Federal Reserve allows for big government, big spending. The Federal Reserve allows for them to expropriate, to literally steal real wealth from America, and it is at the expense at the middle class level and at the poorest of the poor. They have to pay for these inflationary policies through higher prices, and it hurts the poor more than it hurts the rich. The rich are going to hedge themselves. The rich are going to be fine. These big banksters are getting payouts at the expense of all of us.
Yeah, who do you think's getting hurt worse? The poor. So if you're a Democrat, if you're a liberal, if you're a statist, and you truly want to protect these people, keep in mind your buddies that voted for the TARP made a conscious decision to push the losses of the banksters off onto those poor people. We're all paying for their reckless betting, and that's the system we have in place. That was what was created down there on Jekyll Island. The creature from Jekyll Island is a privately owned banking cartel. They create money out of nothing. They collect interest on it, and when they have losses, we pick up the tab. That is the system that we have in place. And picture if we were all hanging on a thread wondering what OPEC was going to do. Well, that's what happens every time the Fed chairman gets up there and tells them how their cartel has manipulated the interest rates during that meeting.
I think as a society, we completely reject the idea of a socialist management of enterprise. We reject the idea that the government should control managing how we produce our sneakers or how we produce our food and groceries. But we, for some reason, accept that they can pass these laws to centrally plan and manage our money supply. The concepts in terms of economics are no different. Alan, I wanted to mention, you brought up...
And our interest rates.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's absolutely absurd. Goldman Sachs, who's one of the big players in this whole scheme...
And a owner of the Federal Reserve System.
Exactly. Reported a record $13.4 billion profit in 2009, while the rest of the country was in the midst of the Great Recession.
And without that bailout, without you paying for their bailout, they would have gone under. But when you're borrowing money from the Federal Reserve for zero, when you have paying nothing for the money and getting interest back from the taxpayers for nothing, you're going to have record profits. Before we get on to the government's role in the banking cartel known as the Federal Reserve System, I would just like to point out that during the TARP, they first asked for, $800 billion, an $800 billion blank check to help the people, so they could keep lending us money and keep the businesses getting their lines of credit. Of course, none of that happened. What happened is it was $3.3 trillion. That's a 30-something% increase in our money supply. That is the inflation we are seeing right now.
Alan, in 2008, in the midst of the financial crisis, when everything was going down, Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson was responsible, along with Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke, about coming to the floor of Congress and coming to the floor of the Senate and requesting all of these bailouts. And Hank Paulson, he's a former Goldman Sachs CEO. The revolving door, they call it a revolving door between the Treasury, Goldman Sachs, and the New York branch of the Federal Reserve is deep, deep throughout history.
We've established that our founding fathers intended for our currency to be gold and silver. Initially silver, then they also used a gold supply. So you can think of gold and silver as the real money. And I will give you an example right now. It looks like the Dow has done really well. The Dow has been falling in terms of real money. It has steadily fallen when compared to gold and silver. So the stock market looks like it's going up. Everything looks like it's going up. What's happening is the dollar is going down. You go to the monetized precious metals, gold and silver, and you relate that to the stock market, and you can really see what's going on. And I will give you an example of the silver quarter. In 1964, which was the last time we had real coins, real money,
Silver quarters.
Real silver quarters. The quarters were 90% silver, 10% copper. The last time that happened was 1964. Keep in mind, that was LBJ, his great society. He needed to be able to inflate to pay those bills. He got off and started printing this cheap crap we've got now, minting it. But in 1964, a gallon of gasoline cost one 1964 quarter. Today, you can buy 2 gallons of gasoline for a 1964 quarter. Gas actually, in real terms, in real money, has gone down. So it's not that gas has gone up so high, it's that the dollar has gone so low. You can take a 1964 quarter out of your pocket and buy 2 gallons of gasoline.
So you're right. In real terms, gasoline prices have actually gone down, but in our inflated, constantly devaluing paper currency, things are getting more and more costly. Another good example, and this is going all the way back thousands of years, if you look at the Roman society, and we've had gold and silver throughout society as being used as money. In Rome, you could get a nice tunic, a nice belt, and a nice pair of shoes for 1 gold coin. Today, you can get a nice suit, a nice leather belt, and a pair of shoes for 1 gold coin.
So that's, you can see that over time, in a normal economy, when you have a stable currency, prices actually will tend to trend lower. And it trends lower because you have productivity gains. People begin to produce more. So the price of goods and services falls. And labor actually increases. And that's how you lift a society out of poverty. If you look at our war on poverty, the gains haven't come since LBJ's Great Society. The gains came prior to that period, prior to us announcing the war on poverty. They came when we had a stable currency that was backed by gold and silver.
One of the things, Alan, that a stable currency does is it incentivizes people to save and incentivizes people to invest. And with real savings and real investment, you get economic productivity. You get productivity gains through better means of production. You get productivity gains through better technology. And what we have today is such a focus on spending and consuming now. All the Federal Reserve's policy right now is directed towards getting us to spend now. You completely destroy incentives to save and invest. And as a result, our real standards of living have been slowly declining for the last couple of decades, not increasing when we had a stable monetary system.
All right, well, we've told you about the cartels side of this partnership. Jason, explain to the audience why the federal government, and that is federal, why the government would enter into a cartel agreement with those crooks down there on Jekyll Island.
Sure, this is something that governments have done for hundreds of years. And what the incentive is for government is they want to pay for all of their programs. And if they can appear to be Santa Claus, if they can appear to be giving all these goodies away for free, the more power to them. If you think about it, the way that a government pays for its programs is either through taxation, through issuing private debt, or through this secret measure of inflating the money supply. Now, if taxes are raised too high, you'll have public outcry. People don't like paying a lot of taxes. If you have private investors buying debt, at a certain point, private investors, like our deficit right now is running in the trillions. Our debt is, if you include unfunded liabilities, $125 trillion. So private investors are becoming very skeptical that the government is going to be able to honor these obligations in the future, so they're pulling back. So it reaches a point where the government can't issue any more private debt. So they result to another very secretive, stealthful way of raising funds, and that is through inflation. Now, if they have a private banking cartel, or some countries have the central bank managed by the government itself, if they have a monopoly control of the money supply, they are able to print money, or in today's terms, just push an electronic button to create new money, to introduce new money into the economy, and they are able to use this money at the current rate or the current value of the new money before it works its way into the economy, before other prices increase, before real wealth is transferred from the society back to the central banks. And
yeah,
Alan,
they're at the nozzle.
They are at the nozzle.
They take that first drink, and when they're done with it, whatever's left over trickles out, and by the time you've gotten to use that money, it's dropped in value.
And the other reason that they like this system is, as we've seen, especially in the last couple months, when private investors no longer want to buy U.S. debt, they have the Federal Reserve there to pick up the slack. You were telling me before we started the show, Alan, I think some pretty interesting stats about the rate at which the Federal Reserve is monetizing the debt and the nature of the new debt that's coming into the system.
Yeah, the Federal Reserve is currently purchasing. Keep in mind, the Federal Reserve does not have any money. They create the money out of thin air. They lend it to the banksters at 0% interest. Then the banksters buy U.S. Treasuries, and that's how this debt is being financed. We'll be back in a few minutes, and we'll see you on the other side of this break.